The Texas sky was burning gold when Sergeant Hiroshi Nakamura realized the war had truly ended. Not with gunfire, not with surrender, but with the smell of smoke, meat, and laughter drifting across an open field. It was late 1945, deep in the heart of Texas, where barbed wire fences met rolling prairie grass. The camp loudspeaker had crackled that afternoon, ordering all prisoners to gather outside. Nakamura expected a head count. Instead, he saw cowboys, real ones, wide-brimmed hats, sunburned faces, dusty boots. They weren't holding rifles, they were holding bottles of beer. The prisoners stood motionless, unsure whether it was a trick. For years they had been taught that capture meant disgrace, that the Americans were devils who would humiliate them before death. Yet now these same enemies were tending open grills, flipping steaks, handing out slices of cornbread, and calling out, "Come on boys, it's chow time." One cowboy reached into a wooden crate, pulled out a cold bottle, and held it toward Nakamura. The glass was sweating in the heat. He hesitated, then took it. The label read, "Lonia Beer." The cowboy grinned. "You earned it, partner. Been a hell of a war." That simple gesture cracked something open inside him. For the first time since his capture, Nakamura didn't feel like a soldier or a prisoner. He felt human. He raised the bottle, nodded silently, and drank. The taste was bitter and strange, but it hit him like freedom. Around him, men who had once sworn to die for the emperor now sat on hay bales, chewing on smoked brisket, listening to American country songs playing from a truck radio. The sound of laughter, real unguarded laughter, filled the air. As the sun dipped below the horizon, one of the cowboys picked up a guitar and began to play. The melody was slow and soulful, something about coming home. The prisoners didn't understand the words, but they understood the feeling. A few began to hum along softly. Even the guards, leaning against the fence, said nothing. The only sound was fire crackling, crickets chirping, and that quiet shared song under the endless Texas sky. That night, Nakamura wrote in his journal, "I thought America would destroy my body. Instead, it destroyed my hatred. The war was over. But for the men sitting around that fire, something greater had begun, a lesson that mercy could be stronger than any weapon." Months before that Texas sunset, Sergeant Hiroshi Nakamura had been certain of one thing: capture meant death. That belief had been drilled into every Japanese soldier from the day he took his oath. The Bushido Code, the warrior's way, was more than tradition. It was a religion. It told him that surrender was a fate worse than execution, that only death could cleanse dishonor. His officers repeated it before every battle. The emperor watches you. Better to die as smoke than live in shame. So when Nakamura's plane went down over the Pacific in 1944, and he was pulled from the water by an American destroyer, his first thought wasn't relief. It was failure. He expected to be beaten, humiliated, perhaps executed. That was what Japanese propaganda had promised. The Americans, they said, were brutes who killed for sport. They were incapable of honor. But when the ship's crew handed him a blanket and hot coffee, the confusion began. The same men who had bombed his comrades were now patching his wounds. One sailor even offered him a cigarette. Nakamura refused at first, expecting a trap, but the man only smiled and said, "Suit yourself, buddy." That word buddy lingered in his mind long after. Weeks later, as his transport train rolled through the heart of America, he saw something else that shook his faith. Cities untouched by war. Fields stretching endlessly to the horizon. People who waved as the train passed, not out of mockery, but curiosity. It was the first time he realized how deeply Japan had misunderstood its enemy. The Bushido illusion was powerful, but it couldn't survive against the evidence of his own eyes. He had believed Americans were soft, obsessed with comfort and luxury. Yet these men had built a country so vast, so organized that even their prison camps ran with efficiency and decency. To the Japanese mind, raised in scarcity and sacrifice, abundance itself was terrifying. By the time Nakamura arrived at Camp Kennedy, Texas, he had stopped believing the war's slogans. Still, he braced for cruelty. He didn't yet understand that his captors were about to deliver something far more devastating than punishment. They were about to show him kindness. In the months ahead, that kindness would do what no bullet ever could. It would dismantle the idea of enemy. When Hiroshi Nakamura stepped off the transport bus and into the blinding Texas sunlight, he wasn't entering a prison. He was stepping into a small, self-contained town built from American efficiency and quiet confidence. The wooden barracks stretched in neat rows. Beyond them stood a mess hall, a hospital tent, a water tower, even a baseball diamond. Above the gate, a simple sign read, Camp Kennedy. For a man who had imagined barbed wire in torture chambers, it was surreal. The United States had prepared for prisoners like him long before the first surrender. Under the Geneva Convention, every captured soldier was to be treated humanely, fed, clothed, and given medical care. The American command took that rule not as a burden, but as a statement of strength. They believed how they treated their prisoners said more about America than any victory on the battlefield. Texas was the perfect setting for such camps. Vast open land, clear weather, and access to rail lines made it ideal for housing large numbers of PSWs far from the front. By 1945, over 50 camps stretched across the state, from the pine forests of Huntsville to the plains near Hereford. They held more than 50,000 German and 5,000 Japanese prisoners. Inside each camp, discipline was strict but fair. Every man had a bunk, clean clothing, and regular meals, often identical to what U.S. soldiers ate. In Camp Kennedy, PS could borrow books, attend English classes, or even watch Hollywood films in the recreation hall. The first time Nakamura saw a movie, he was stunned. On screen, an American cowboy rode across a sunset landscape that looked just like the land outside the camp fence. The guard beside him whispered, "That's real Texas, friend." Work programs became another shock. Instead of punishment, prisoners were offered paid labor, 20 cents a day, to work in cotton fields, sawmills, or cattle ranches. The goal wasn't to break them, it was to keep them active, and to show that America's war machine had room even for its enemies. Cowboys from nearby towns often served as overseers, treating the prisoners with the same gruff humor they gave anyone else. There were fences, yes, and guards with rifles. But the sense of menace faded quickly. The real weapon here wasn't fear. It was normally clean water, fresh food, a chance to breathe. One evening, Nakamura stood at the fence and watched the horizon. Beyond the wire, the prairie rolled on endlessly, glowing under the last light of day. He thought of home. Rationed rice, blackouts, cities in ruins. And for the first time he wondered, if America could afford to treat its enemies this well, how could Japan ever hope to win? That thought stayed with him longer than any guard's command. It was the beginning of understanding that the war's outcome had been decided not by courage or honor, but by abundance. In war, mercy can be measured in numbers. And when Hiroshi Nakamura began to see the numbers, the illusion of Japan's invincibility shattered faster than any shell could break steel. The U.S. Army didn't just defeat its enemies with bullets, it buried them under arithmetic. At Camp Kennedy, every prisoner received 3 meals a day totaling more than 3,000 calories. Meat, potatoes, bread, milk, and sometimes even fruit. By contrast, a Japanese infantryman still fighting in the jungles of the Philippines often survived on fewer than 900 calories, mostly rice and dried fish. In U.S. camps, prisoners gained weight. In Japanese camps, American POWs withered to skeletons. The numbers told the truth that propaganda could not. America's strength wasn't cruelty but capacity. Every barracks had electricity. Every meal came on time. When a prisoner fell ill, he saw a doctor trained in the same medical schools that served U.S. soldiers. The camp infirmary had real beds, clean linens, morphine, antibiotics. Japan's frontline hospitals barely had bandages. One day, Nakamura watched an American medic treat a feverish guard and a Japanese prisoner in the same room. He couldn't comprehend it. Compassion had never been part of his military vocabulary. Then came work assignments. Every Japanese PE earned 20 cents a day, equivalent to about $3 now, for honest labor on American soil. They could buy shaving cream, paper, even chocolate at the camp store. The first time Nakamura tasted Hershey's, he stared at the wrapper as if it were treasure from another planet. Later, he wrote in his notebook, "Their soldiers are not gods, but they live like gods." There were other figures that haunted him. The guards mentioned that American factories produced 96,000 aircraft in 1944 alone, nearly 8,000 planes a month. That was more than Japan had built in the entire war. One American state, Michigan, produced more trucks than the entire Japanese empire. Another, Texas, had trained 200,000 pilots. Even in captivity, Nakamura could see the engine of an empire still accelerating. He realized that America's true battlefield wasn't Europe or the Pacific. It was its own assembly lines, its railroads, its farms. While Japan rationed rice, America rationed luxury. While Japan built weapons by hand, America built weapons by system. That realization came slowly, but when it did, it was devastating. The PS began whispering to each other at night, trading. Small discoveries. Did you see the bread today? They throw away what we would die for. Maybe this is why we lost. The math of mercy was absolute. Every calorie, every cigarette, every blanket carried the same silent message. You cannot defeat a nation that feeds its enemies better than you feed your heroes. For Nakamura, that truth didn't destroy his pride. It redefined it. Honor was no longer about dying for the emperor. It was about learning how to live in a world where mercy was strength. By the spring of 1945, Hiroshi Nakamura's world had transformed from the cockpit of a burning aircraft to the saddle of a horse on a Texas ranch. The day he first stepped onto the open range, the air smelled of dust, grass, and sun-baked leather. He had been told that his work detail would involve light labor, but he couldn't have imagined what that meant in the language of cowboys. When the truck pulled up to the ranch outside San Antonio, the gate stood wide open. No guard towers, no machine guns, just long fences, cattle, and the lowing of steers under the hot sun. The ranch foreman, a weathered man with a red bandana around his neck, greeted them with a nod. "You boys ever worked cows?" he asked, half amused. No one answered. The prisoners stood stiff, their khaki uniforms immaculate, their posture perfect. To them, work meant obedience under punishment. But here the cowboys seemed more like teachers than overseers. One tossed Nakamura a wide-brimmed hat. "You'll need this. The Texas sun don't play fair. The first days were brutal. The men stumbled in their boots, burned their hands on rope, and fell from horses that refused to cooperate." The cowboys laughed, not out of cruelty, but in the same way soldiers laugh at each other's first mistakes. Slowly, something strange happened. Laughter became contagious. The PS began to joke among themselves, mimicking the cowboys' slang. Nakamura learned to say howdy and y'all, though his accent made the others laugh. It was here on that open land that the rigid discipline of Bushido began to melt into something more human. Each morning they rode out to repair fences or herd cattle. The sky was endless, the silence broken only by the creak of saddles and the whistle of the wind. The cowboys never spoke much about the war. To them, these Japanese men were just workers, not enemies. At lunchtime they shared biscuits and beans straight from the pan. Once a cowboy named Bill offered Nakamura a sip from his canteen. Cold, sweet water with a hint of lemon. It tasted better than anything Nakamura had ever drunk in his life. By midsummer, the line between guard and prisoner had blurred. The men were paid their wages just like any hired hand. One Saturday, the ranch owner drove them into town for supplies. As they passed through the main street, local children waved at the trucks. Some townsfolk frowned, others smiled. To most Texans, the war felt far away. Here, people were judged not by flags, but by whether they worked hard and told the truth. That evening, after weeks of hard labor, the ranch hands built a campfire. Someone turned on a portable radio. The music was slow and twangy, a cowboy song about lost loves and open trails. The Japanese prisoners listened silently, each lost in thought. One of them, a young mechanic from Osaka, whispered, This is freedom." Nakamura didn't answer, but he understood. For men who had been raised to believe their enemy was a monster, Texas was rewriting every chapter of what it meant to lose a war. They had been spared not out of weakness, but because their captors had nothing to fear. That night, looking out at the stars burning over the prairie, Nakamura realized the war had taught him nothing about America. Texas was teaching him everything. The longer Hiroshi Nakamura stayed in Texas, the more his world cracked open. Each sunrise brought proof that everything he had believed about honor, duty, and strength had been built on sand. Back home, his commanders had called the Americans soft, slaves to pleasure and comfort. Yet here, Even the simplest farmer lived better than any officer in Tokyo. Abundance wasn't decadence, it was control. At Camp Kennedy, food arrived in mountains. Fresh bread every morning, meat on every tray, coffee that never ran out. The guards complained about ration stamps, but to a Japanese prisoner who had eaten rice mixed with sawdust in wartime Japan, the idea of shortage in America was a joke. Nakamura began to understand the United States didn't just win battles, it outproduced war itself. Even in peace, America's power never slept. But abundance did more than fill stomachs, it broke minds. Late at night, prisoners whispered about the contradiction they couldn't process. If they are monsters, one man said, why do they feed us like family? The question spread like wildfire. Some refused to believe it, insisting the food was a trick, the kindness a test. Others began to write secret diaries trying to make sense of the unthinkable, that the enemy's humanity was real. One afternoon, Nakamura overheard a guard and a cowboy talking near the fence. These boys ain't bad, the guard said, just fought for the wrong flag. That line struck him harder than any bullet. The Americans didn't hate them. They didn't even seem to take the war personally. They fought, they won, they moved on. At night, as Sika sang in the heat, Nakamura watched the guards laughing by the barracks, sharing cigarettes, arguing about baseball scores. For the first time, he felt a strange longing, not to escape, but to belong. The rigid lines that had defined his identity were dissolving into something softer, something dangerously close to admiration. It terrified him. How could mercy feel more powerful than victory? How could kindness humiliate him more than defeat? Then one morning, a Red Cross truck arrived with mail from home. The letters told of burned cities, starving families, children digging for roots to eat. And there he was, alive, well-fed, surrounded by music and laughter in a place his leaders had called barbaric. That was the moment Hiroshi Nakamura stopped being a prisoner of war. He became a prisoner of doubt. December 1945. The war had been over for months, but in Texas, the warmth of its victory still glowed across the plains. At Camp Kennedy, winter came soft. Cool evenings, quiet winds, a sky clear enough to see every star. For the Japanese prisoners, the season carried no meaning. Christmas, they thought, was a foreign ritual of a foreign god. Yet that week something extraordinary began to happen. The cowboys who worked the nearby ranches started hauling wood and food into camp. A small group of American wives arrived with baskets of bread, pies, and vegetables. One woman set up a photograph on a crate and smiled at the prisoners through the fence. The guards told the men, "No drills today, we're having a Christmas barbecue." The announcement spread through the barracks like rumor, half believed, half feared. When the sun began to fall, the gates opened. Tables lined with roasted beef, potatoes, beans, and cornbread filled the open yard. An American chaplain gave a short speech about peace and forgiveness. Then, to the prisoner's astonishment, he bowed, a gesture of respect learned from Japanese customs. "Tonight," he said, "we eat as men, not enemies." No one moved at first. It took one cowboy, hat tipped low, to cross the line and hand a paper plate to Sergeant Nakamura. "Eat up, partner," he said. "You've earned a meal." The word partner struck deeper than any sermon. Nakamura took a cautious bite. The smoky flavor of the meat filled his mouth. Around him, his comrades began to eat slowly, awkwardly, then with hunger that surprised them. Laughter broke out as a few cowboys tried teaching Japanese prisoners how to say "Merry Christmas." Someone turned up the photograph, and Bing Crosby's voice drifted through the cold evening air singing, "I'll be home for Christmas." Then came the gift. The ranch owner, a burly man with a thick mustache, opened a crate and began passing out harmonicas. "Music don't care what side you fought on," he said. "Let's hear something from you boys." One prisoner, a quiet schoolteacher from Kyoto, stepped forward and played a haunting melody, a Japanese folk song about longing for home. When he finished, silence hung for a moment. Then one of the Americans strummed his guitar and picked up the tune, turning it into something new, half Japanese, half Texan. The two sounds wove together until even the guards joined in clapping. Under the Texas stars, enemies became musicians. That night, back in his barracks, Nakamura wrote by the dim light of a lantern. "I thought honor was dying for my country, but tonight I learned that honor may also be recognizing humanity, even in your enemy. The Christmas feast became legend inside Camp Kennedy. Prisoners spoke of it for years afterward, long after they returned home. Some said that night did what the atomic bombs could not. It ended the war inside them. For Nakamura, the lesson was simple but unshakable. America's real victory was not in firepower, but in forgiveness. 2 days after the Christmas barbecue, Hiroshi Nakamura sat alone in the small wooden barracks, a piece of lined paper on his lap. For months he had avoided writing to his family in Tokyo. Every attempt began with pride and ended in silence. What could he say? That he was alive while his comrades were ashes? That the land he fought for had fallen? But now, with the faint smell of smoke and roasted beef still clinging to his jacket, he finally found the words. He wrote slowly, his English-Japanese dictionary open beside him, switching between languages as the emotion demanded. "Father," he began, "I have seen something I cannot explain. The Americans are not what we were told." His handwriting wavered. "They are strong because they work together. Even their prisoners share in their abundance. They believe in fairness, in laughter, in things that do not need orders to exist." Outside, the wind rattled the tin roof. From the guard tower, a radio played faintly. A country song about home and love. It seemed impossible that the same nation could both create such music and drop bombs that destroyed cities. Yet here he was drinking coffee with cowboys who smiled without hatred. "When I return," he wrote, "I want to teach my students that kindness is also a weapon." He paused, realizing the weight of that sentence. Kindness, a weapon? It felt absurd, but also true. The Americans didn't conquer by humiliation. They conquered by generosity. By proving that freedom could feed the world better than fear ever could. He remembered something the ranch owner had said at the barbecue. "Son, winning ain't about making the other fella starve. It's about making sure everyone eats when the dust settles." Nakamura smiled faintly. In that moment, he knew that Japan's defeat wasn't just military, it was philosophical. His country had tried to build greatness through control and obedience. America had built it through trust. As he folded the letter, he looked around the dim barracks. Some men slept, some played cards, one was carving a small wooden horse, a gift for one of the cowboys' children. These men, once soldiers of the emperor, were now learning how to live again. When the letter finally reached Tokyo months later, his sister wept as she read it aloud to their mother. "We lost the war," it said in closing, "but maybe we found something greater, a way to begin again." Years later, long after the war ended, visitors to Texas would still hear stories of the Japanese prisoners who became cowboys for a season. Some even returned after the war as immigrants, chasing the peace they had discovered behind barbed wire. For Nakamura, that Christmas letter marked the end of one life and the quiet beginning of another. The moment a soldier became a human being again. Spring 1946. The Texas sun was already rising hot when the trucks rolled through Camp Kennedy's gates. The war had been over for months, and now the long-awaited repatriation had begun. Japanese POWs, thinner, wiser, and strangely quieter than when they'd arrived, lined up with duffel bags slung over their shoulders. Some smiled, others stared at the horizon, where the orange dawn melted into the open plains. Hiroshi Nakamura stood near the front of the line, holding a single suitcase. Inside were 3 things: a harmonica gifted by a cowboy, a worn English dictionary, and his mother's letter from Tokyo. He looked back at the camp one last time. The barracks, the fences, the flagpole that had flown both the rising sun and the stars and stripes. The air smelled faintly of coffee and horses, a scent he would never forget. When the truck rumbled toward the port, he saw Texas fade behind him. The ranches, the wide skies, the people who had shown him that enemies could share the same humanity. As they boarded the transport ship bound for Yokohama, an American sergeant handed each man a box lunch and, to Nakamura's surprise, a small bottle of Coca-Cola. "One last taste of Texas," the man said. Nakamura bowed deeply before stepping aboard. The voyage home was long and quiet. The prisoners gathered on deck, staring out at the endless Pacific. They spoke in soft tones about the America they had seen. The roads that stretched forever, the trains that ran on time, the farms that grew food enough for entire nations. None of it had seemed possible when they left Japan. Now they understood why they had lost. When Japan's coastline finally came into view, a collective gasp rose from the men. Tokyo lay in ruins. The once mighty city was a landscape of ash and twisted metal. Smoke still rose from distant districts. The docks were crowded with hollow-eyed civilians scavenging among wrecks. It looked less like a return home than an arrival on another planet. As Nakamura stepped onto Japanese soil, a strange guilt filled him. He had eaten well while his people starved. He had seen abundance while they had seen destruction. But with the guilt came resolve. He would not waste what he had learned. He found his family living in a makeshift shelter outside Tokyo. His mother was frail, his sister thin as paper, but both were alive. When he told them of the kindness he had seen in Texas, the cowboys, the barbecue, the laughter, they listened in disbelief. The Americans? His sister asked. They were kind. Nakamura nodded. Kindness was their strength. And that is why we must learn from them, not hate them. In the months that followed, he began teaching English to neighborhood children using the old dictionary he had carried from Texas. He taught them not only words, but ideas, cooperation, fairness, freedom. The seeds planted in a pea camp in Texas had found soil in post-war Japan. Years later he would write, "We were defeated by bombs and bullets." Yes, but what truly conquered us was the smile of a cowboy and the taste of Coca-Cola under a Texas sunset. Years turned into decades, and Japan transformed in ways few could have imagined in 1945. From the rubble of defeat rose glittering cities, humming factories, and the world's most advanced industries. Yet beneath the steel and neon of this new nation lay something quieter, a cultural echo from the faraway plains of Texas. For men like Hiroshi Nakamura, the lessons learned as a P had never faded. He often told his students about that Christmas barbecue, about how the Americans had shared food and music instead of chains and punishment. His stories sounded almost mythical to post-war generations, a place where enemies shared laughter and Coca-Cola. But they were true. America's power, he would say, was not only in machines but in spirit, the belief that respect makes nations strong. By the 1960s, Japan had become one of the most industrialized nations in the world. The values that fueled its rebirth, efficiency, cooperation and innovation, were strikingly similar to what Nakamura and his fellow prisoners had witnessed in Texas. Former POWs who had worked alongside cowboys and farmers had seen firsthand how teamwork could move mountains. Now, in factories and offices across Japan, they applied those same principles to rebuild their country. Many of them never forgot their captors' kindness. Some even wrote letters to the ranch families who had once guarded them. Others returned to Texas no longer as prisoners, but as guests. The locals remembered them fondly, the polite men who had sung Japanese folk songs under the stars, the men who had learned to rope cattle, mend fences, and ride horses. One Texas newspaper in 1970 ran a feature titled "The POWs Who Became Cowboys." The article told of former Japanese soldiers visiting their old camp, now overgrown with weeds, and standing silently where the mess hall once stood. One man bent down, brushed the dust from the ground, and whispered, "This is where I learned to live again." For many of those men, the Texas experience became a personal legend. A story of defeat transformed into dignity. They passed it to their children and grandchildren, who grew up in a peaceful Japan that prized hard work and mutual respect. When American culture returned to Japan through Coca-Cola, jazz, and Western movies, it no longer felt foreign. It felt familiar, a continuation of the strange friendship born behind barbed wire. Hiroshi Nakamura lived to see his students grow into engineers, teachers, and diplomats. In his final years, he often sat on his porch overlooking the rebuilt streets of Tokyo, sipping a cold soda and humming the same cowboy tune he had learned in 1945. To visitors who asked about the war, he would smile and say, "Texas taught me the secret of victory. Kindness builds what bombs destroy." When he died in 1983, his students placed a small wooden carving of a horse beside his grave, a symbol of the life he had touched and the bridge he had helped build between two former enemies. Today, if you visit the old campgrounds of Texas, where barbed wire once gleamed under the sun, you can still find traces of that extraordinary encounter, the ghosts of men who discovered that even in captivity, humanity can find freedom. And in the soft wind that rolls across the plains, it said you can almost hear it, the faint echo of laughter, a harmonica, and the clink of Coca-Cola bottles under a Texas sunset.